Hi everyone, and welcome to our video for week 9, looking at the long-term impact of experiences in informal settings. In addition to the assigned readings for this week, myself, Brad, Emmerich, and Carisha have chosen an article by Falk et al. From 2018 looking at the contribution of various science-rich resources to the public's interest in science. To give a brief introduction to the paper we've chosen, Falk et al. Looked at the contribution of 5 significant factors that influence an adult's interest in science. These include formal and informal environments, multimedia and print sources, and of course, the internet. The author's main observations were that frequent positive experiences in and out of school at various points through life paralleled adults' positive perceptions of and strong interest in science. One of the main reasons we chose this paper is its unique lens. Falk et al. Acknowledged that extant research has focused on factors that relate either to improving or hampering the public's understanding of science as adults, or to why people do or don't pursue science-related careers. Many of the papers I've read throughout this program fall into this category, especially the idea of how science education connects to post-secondary pursuits and the creation of the labor force. Maltese and Tay from 2011 noted that while the number of people earning bachelor's degrees in the last 50 or 60 years has grown significantly, comparatively fewer and fewer students earn degrees in STEM-related fields. Maltese et al. From 2014 examined this further, finding that despite most young people holding positive views of math and science, many lose interest in STEM fields throughout their education, with few starting STEM-related degrees and even fewer finishing them. Using the language of the National Research Council's Next Generation Science Standards, Maltese et al. Call this loss of students from possible STEM careers the leaky pipeline. This confirms one viewpoint that the role of education is to funnel students into productive career choices, and that currently educational systems are failing to achieve that goal. Takeuchi et al.'s extensive literature review covering the decade from 2007 to 2017 found that this pipeline metaphor is an overwhelmingly common theme in STEM-related research. Emmerich, Carisha, and I connected with Falk et al.'s paper because they examine the problem from the standpoint of understanding the origin of people's interest in science, as they view successfully creating, fostering, and maintaining an interest in science as important prerequisites to a public with high scientific literacy. The authors take the position that whether young people pursue science vocationally or not, they need a certain level of scientific understanding, something that starts with an interest in the topic. Given our roles as classroom teachers, knowing more about what can build interest in science is important. Picking up on the notion of scientific literacy, the growth and popularity of online sources means learners today have ready and steady access to a wealth of both information and misinformation. This means the ability to evaluate the sources of information and to discern their validity is more important than ever. Historically, people tended to learn what they needed to know. Today, people can learn what they want to know. However, there's no guarantee what they learn is coming from experts. This also blurs the distinctions between where, when, and how people learn science concepts and about scientific approaches. Understanding these non-traditional avenues of learning is therefore becoming increasingly important. Further, Falk et al. Want to investigate the directionality of influences, wondering whether people become interested in science at school, then carry that interest to other areas of life, or do they find interest outside of school and bring it to the formal learning environment? Falk et al.'s paper also draws connections to some of this week's assigned reading. Among other things, Strauss et al.'s paper addresses the challenges of longitudinal studies, those that examine the same variable over time frames of varying lengths. Typically, these studies are qualitative in nature, relying on surveys or interviews conducted prior to and after a site visit or following some other kind of intervention. Studies that investigate single visits or one-off interventions generate limited data, making it difficult for researchers to make inferences or to apply trends to other situations. Similarly, short-term studies create more of a snapshot of understanding rather than a longer duration film which evolves with time and context. Given that conceptual change, framework construction, and transforming knowledge into understanding all take time, short-term studies risk missing important insights into the totality of the learning process. Attrition is a primary concern of longer-term studies. The longer a participant's commitment to a study, the higher the likelihood they will drop out, particularly if their involvement is not compulsory. Complicating that is the reality that as attrition rates go up, bias enters the collected data, becoming a threat to the study's validity once the attrition rate reaches certain thresholds. Attrition occurs for two main reasons: loss of interest and loss of contact. Maintaining interest commonly relies on participant buy-in, clear communication, and incentives. However, each comes with associated challenges. For example, buy-in can change. Incentives can be expensive and pose ethical issues, and regular updates and incentives can both influence study responses moving forward. Fortunately, social media and personal cell phone numbers mean simply losing contact is becoming less common. Attribution is also a challenge, as correlation isn't causation. When viewing outcomes, researchers must assess whether participant experiences caused the observed outcomes, only contributed to them, happened to occur concurrently but by coincidence, or had no effect at all. Also, learning occurs over time, at different rates, and in social contexts. Attempting to determine the causal relationship between learning experiences and learning outcomes is difficult at best and impossible at worst. Strauss et al. Further explain two types of longitudinal studies, prospective and retrospective. Prospective studies follow selected participants for the duration of the study. Though there is no required time frame, most are at least 1 year. The pros of this type of study relate to their real-time nature, as researchers observe and interact with participants as events play out, or very soon after. The cons relate to their ongoing nature, as the study design carries costs and may not be sufficiently adaptive. Attrition rates also increase with longer studies. Retrospective studies eliminate the ongoing nature of prospective studies by having participants reflect on past experiences and events rather than observing them as they happen. The pros of this type of study relate to their duration and efficiency, as the one-off sampling nature reduces attrition rates and costs. The cons relate to the fallacies of human memory, as even vivid recall isn't always accurate. Also, the conditions during the experiences and during the later recollection may not align, requiring compensation. For context, the paper by Mochehali et al. Describes a typical example of a prospective longitudinal study. The researchers followed middle school students over a 2-year span, collecting data through surveys and interviews as participants experienced the events in real time. The authors found that despite students showing increased interest in STEM subjects upon completing the program, they did not maintain that interest after 2 further years of schooling outside the program. Interestingly though, while students articulated dissatisfaction with subsequent classroom activities affecting their interest in the STEM subjects, they still voiced interest in STEM-related careers. This was largely due to the program informing them of what STEM professions actually do. The limitations of this study center around the generalizability of the results. Given the small number of students observed, the fact that the study examined the effect of one specific program, and the absence of a control group to establish correlation between observations and experiences. Although these authors did not experience the challenges of attrition, they did confront those of attribution. The paper by Anderson and Gosselin describes a typical example of a retrospective longitudinal study. The researchers interviewed 50 Canadians, 25 from BC and 25 from Quebec, who all attended Expo 67 in Montreal. The authors' main findings were that participants' recollections depended greatly on their perceived experiences, highlighting the individual constructivism that results from lived experiences. That is, apart from common factual convergence, experiences are personal, dependent on sociocultural identity, and emotional connection. In a similarly constructed study, Anderson and Shimizu interviewed 48 Japanese who attended Expo 70 in Osaka. The authors found that participant memories are colored by individual values and that the memories of those learning experiences continue on after the event itself is over. They also found that the events which evoked strong emotions, both good and bad, were those that participants most vividly remembered. The authors conclude that those who plan museum exhibits and the experiences they engender must do their best to maximize positive affect and that allow visitors to meet or exceed their agenda expectations. For long-term memory formation, the visitor's experiences and interactions with exhibits are just as, if not more important, than the content of those exhibits.
For a paper to complement this week's readings, we chose a study by Falk, Pattison, Meyer, Bibas, and Livingston, examining the contribution of science-rich resources to public science interest. We chose this paper because it's an example of a retrospective study, and we were interested in how the authors examined the contributions of multiple informal science learning experiences to both public science interest and to the development of positive attitudes towards science. Their findings highlight which types of youth experiences were predictors of positive science values as an adult. They also examined which free choice science learning opportunities may have the most impact on current adult science interest. We thought that the different angles that they examined offer us an opportunity to reflect on informal science learning experiences outside of our classrooms, but complementary to our practice. And these can potentially sustain lifelong learning, as well as encourage positive attitudes towards science long after people leave formal education. The authors had two distinct research objectives when it came to examining adults' current science interest values, one of which was the frequency of the adult's current and prior visits, and the other of which was examining the self-perceptions of the quality of their current and prior experiences. Though the paper was published in 2018, the data was gathered in 2015 from telephone surveys conducted via a computer-generated, unweighted, random digit dialing telephone sample, including both landlines and cell phones. The algorithm was designed to include unlisted and newly listed household numbers, but was pre-screened to remove business, commercial, and disconnected numbers. A cross-section of calls were made during late afternoon, evening, and weekend hours to minimize any potential bias due to work schedules. And only after 6 unsuccessful attempts was a selected household replaced by a new number in the sample. The interviews were conducted by professional, trained interviewers who asked questions using a 4-point Likert type scale, ranging from agree a lot to disagree a lot. And any partially completed interviews were not counted in the sample total if a person decided to opt out before the interview was finished. The participants for the study consisted of 3,001 adults. In the United States, adult age is defined as 21, but the authors chose to define adult as anyone over the age of 18. The random samples were drawn from residents in 3 communities: Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Philadelphia. Of the numbers that were dialed, 21.7% of respondents completed the telephone survey, 6% completed it in Spanish, and 94% completed it in English. During the interviews, additional demographic information was collected. This included gender, age, ethnicity, the languages spoken in the home, how long the respondent had lived in the city in which the data were collected, their highest level of education, and their 2014 household income, which was the last full taxation and calendar year prior to the survey. Sampling bias was then minimized by weighting the results according to the US Census data so that it would be comparable to demographics from each of the 3 jurisdictions based on Greater Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Philadelphia. Now, the interviewers were also trained to define science to the participants. The authors felt that just the term science was too broad, and it may not be clear to adults what would count, or if they were interested in only select areas of science, they may not consider other topics as science. So during the survey introduction, the interviewers made it clear that participants should think about the subject of science quite broadly and include topics such as space exploration, nutrition, cooking, bird watching, and psychology. And in describing the science learning experiences, they encouraged participants to think about activities that help people stay current on science topics or ways in which they generally find out more about science. Because the major data collection methodology was based on participants' self-reporting, the authors undertook a number of different ways to try to minimize any issues with the self-reporting. Participants were asked to self-report the frequency of their science-related use of each educational medium. So that would include science centers, internet, broadcast media such as television shows related to science, and books or magazines about science. Basing their frequency on a 6-point Likert scale ranging from never to every day. Additionally, to measure participants' perception of their science experience quality, they were asked 9 questions related to each of those experiences and rated it using a 4-point Likert type scale, ranging from disagree a lot to agree a lot. So it is of interest to note that neither scale included a neutral or middle ground. It's also important to note that the authors followed up at a later date with a subset of participants to ensure that their answers had not changed significantly. The authors found two very interesting sets of results about current activities and about former youth activities when it came to adult interest in science. With regards to current activities, they found that current adult free choice learning experiences, such as visiting a science center, reading books and magazines about science, and using the internet to learn more about science, were the most significant predictors of current adult science interest, as well as their values and predispositions. Watching science-related television or other types of broadcast media did not seem to have a significant impact on their current science interest. Given that a picture is worth 1,000 words, let's have a look at that graphically. So to look at current adult usage of 4 different types of educational media, including Science Center, internet, television as the primary broadcast medium, and reading, and that is of science-related books and magazines. We have this chart looking at their side-by-side usage. It's also interesting to note that individuals who utilized at least one of the 5 selected media were more likely to have utilized other forms of educational science media as well. It also appeared in the results that individuals with the best experiences, so the most positive experiences, were also likely to be the most frequent users. The retrospective part of this study had the current adults, after reporting on their current frequency and usage, also self-report on their previous activities as a youth. And it was found that positive experiences visiting a science center and watching science-related television as an early adolescent were the most significant predictors of their current adult science interests, values, and predispositions. It was very interesting that early adult positive experiences reading science-related books or based on science classroom experiences did not necessarily predict current interest as an adult in science. So given the retrospective nature of the study, the current adults were asked to self-report on their younger usage of these 4 science-rich media. We do run into a little hiccup, and that should be noted under the internet never frequency, where that is an aggregation of never and never/not yet invented responses. When you think about the adult population in 2015 as being anyone over the age of 18, there is a significant number of the respondents that would have been considerably older, because over 18 is a broad definition, and in their youth, the internet wasn't available yet. So it does make direct comparison a little bit difficult when we saw that internet and science-related television were the most frequently used current resources, but internet usage during the current adult's youth was limited because of its recent emergence as an educational science material. If this same study was to be conducted again 5 or 10 years later, that may be a different comparison that could be made there.
Hi everyone, this is Emmerich. So in reference to the previous slide, the data suggests that although all forms of informal experiences are important for the development of sustained science interest into adulthood, their influence varies depending on a participant's age. We see that science-related television had a greater impact earlier in life, whereas print media had a greater influence later on. The authors also found that overall, internet and science-related television were the most frequently used resources, whereas science centers were the least utilized of the resources under study, although science center visits seem to have similarly significant impacts regardless of age. One important thing to note is that reported internet usage of adults during adolescence was limited, likely due to the limited availability of the internet itself, in addition to a potential lack of any web-based resources. Overall, it was found that having frequent, positive science-related experiences in and out of school, both early and later in life, correlated with having a strong value and cognitive predispositional interest in science as an adult. Of note, and in line with our previous readings, Results showed that although many individuals indicated having positive classroom science experiences, these school-based experiences did not significantly contribute to most adults' long-term science interest values and predispositions after controlling for other factors. All of this brings us to a sort of chicken and egg situation in regard to experiences versus interest. The authors cannot attribute a specific directionality to these constructs and therefore cannot conclude whether it is an individual's interests that motivates them to engage with informal science experiences or if it is those same experiences that stimulate further interest. It could easily be argued that both scenarios are equally valid and likely occur in tandem. The results also seem to support previous research indicating the presence of various social inequities that exist in the United States. Data suggests a statistically significant influence of race, ethnicity, and income on science interest and predispositions, with Caucasian respondents reporting higher value in cognitive interest in science when compared with their Hispanic, Latino, Latina, and Black counterparts. Higher income was also more strongly correlated with increased interest amongst respondents, suggesting financial barriers might limit participation in informal science experiences for certain segments of the population. Factors that were shown to have no significant impact on science value and cognitive predispositional interest were gender and age. This is contrary to a number of other previously reported studies, which are cited on page 438 of this paper. Overall, the authors found that multiple experiences, both formal and informal, are responsible for promoting and sustaining one's interest in science into adulthood, although free choice experiences seem to have greater influence than formal schooling. Given that informal learning experiences were shown to have higher correlation with adult science interest, efforts need to be made to ensure that such experiences are accessible to all, regardless of their socioeconomic status. Efforts should also be made to widen the scope of what qualifies as a complete science education, the definition of which should include increased opportunities and emphasis on informal learning experiences. Or, as the authors here more eloquently put it, to create a citizenry who are persistently interested in science requires building all parts of the science learning infrastructure and focusing on all citizens, not just a few parts and some individuals. Study limitations. The first and most obvious limitation for the present study is the difficulty in evaluating the impact of technology that didn't necessarily exist when the adult participants reported on their adolescent experiences. It is also evident that the quality of science education can vary considerably from one classroom to another, dependent on a number of factors, including the teacher, available resources, and district priorities, among many others. Self-reports of classroom experiences will undoubtedly take shape according to individual context and will be shaped according to each participant's affective and rehearsed memories. Finally, this study fails to assess the quality of the various media under study. This is something that can be influenced not only by the participant's own perception of a given experience, but also by the overall quality of the experience itself. Since the media sources under study were not vetted following participants' self-reports, it is impossible to account for the presence of biased or completely false information influencing reported levels of science interest. A final limitation is the difficulty in generalizing the findings to the broader population. Authors recognize the specifics may not be precisely applicable to other areas of the US or other countries, but do suggest that the general ideas are broadly applicable and could form a valid starting point for similar research in other geographic locations. So where does this leave us in terms of future research? The authors recognize that learning is a highly complex process that is unique to each individual. Although the findings of the present study are difficult to generalize across the broader population, the authors hope that their results will spark serious debate about improving science education policies and possibly widening the scope to include other forms of science education when considering how best to improve society's scientific literacy. In other words, formal schooling should not be uniquely prioritized over other informal mechanisms which appear to have greater influence on future science interest. Following this week's readings, we would ask everyone to reflect on the following discussion questions. Number 1. Do you have any distinct, highly persistent memories of informal or formal learning experiences that, in retrospect, you would attribute to having a significant impact on your choice to be involved with science? Number 2. Do you feel that the integrity of your memory of the experiences has held true over time and can be clearly connected or attributed to your interest in science, i.e., is it causal or correlational? And finally, number 3. It is clear from this week's readings that media consumption, social or other, could be considered an informal experience that can significantly shape one's science interest, values, and cognitive predispositions. Knowing now that informal experiences appear to have greater influence on these factors than formal ones, do you think steps should be taken, either in formal or informal settings, to limit or counteract the influence of poor quality media, i.e. misinformation? If so, what should be done?